First, I have three friends that want to say hello. Those of you who have heard me speak over the years know that this is Bubbles, who's a manatee. This is Fred, the platypus, who's been with me for many years. And this is Fred's friend Maxine, who I claim is an emu, although she may have been an ostrich at one point. Anyway, they wanted to be here, and they wanted to tell you that they may never see you again, because they normally give a kids presentation, but there are so few kids at our Zoom meetings that they aren't doing it. Anyway, and I didn't write them a script, and so they just wanted to say hello. They have enjoyed coming to our meetings. That's for the serious part of the presentation. Now we get down to the other part. This is going to be just an odd angle on socialism. It's not at all what a professor would give. The subject of my talk today is socialism. Let me begin by telling you why I chose this topic. Until the last few years, I knew next to nothing about socialism. Though I had some understanding of democracy, capitalism, and economics, a lot of what I knew was shallow or badly distorted by believing that the United States had the best political and economic system in the world. As I see it, each nation has a particular mix of politics, values, culture, economics, and various other components that determine the experience of its people. I'm going to use the word system to describe that mix. I'll read that again to you. Politics, values, culture, economics, other components that determine the experience of people. When I use the word system, I'm usually referring to that mix. I use it mostly in reference to nations, but it could be applied to something as small as a family or as big as the human race. I will address several issues in this talk. I'll define a form of socialism I advocate and how it differs from the forms of socialism I do not advocate. I will discuss the bias against socialism in the U.S., why it exists, and why much of it is inappropriate for the form of socialism I advocate. I will discuss why I've become disillusioned with the leading role that capitalism plays in our system. I will give some perspective on those nations that currently have the form of socialism I advocate. I now think our system, and I want to get back, remember the system is the whole big mix that determines our experience in life. Our system in the United States is failing badly. I am in search of what would be better for us and for others. The best system I have found so far can be labeled democratic socialism. I intend to describe a form of democratic socialism that I advocate and to explain my reasons for this choice. Oh, by the way, let me set my clock. I have been known to go over on these talks. I will also discuss what I think of as the demonization of the label socialism. There are also some forms of socialism that I think are better than our system. There are some forms of socialism that do not appeal to me. A big part of my changed perspective relates to learning about the different kinds of socialism. This all began a few years ago in a series of conversations I had with my friend Rufus Morrison. Over the last 10 years or so, I had become disillusioned and disappointed in our system. In particular, I had come to the realization that the role of capitalism in our system was to some extent dysfunctional and harmful. Later in this talk, I will discuss how and why my opinion on capitalism changed. I had mentioned my concerns about capitalism to Rufus, and he responded that he had similar views. He then said he was, in some ways, a socialist, and that he thought a form of socialism would be preferable to our system. I commented that so far as I knew, socialism consisted of autocratic, centralized system run by a central authority, usually a kind of dictator, with little personal freedom. I mentioned China, North Korea, and Cuba as examples. Rufus said he was talking about a different kind of socialism, and that the examples he would suggest were along the lines of those in Finland and Sweden. We have continued to discuss this area since then. I have made an effort to learn about the different kinds of socialism, mostly using the internet. I've also done some reading in 2 books and an online article suggested to me, and I had a lovely page to share with you. My computer is refusing to do that, so I won't do it. But here are the two books. Oh, is that backwards to you? It's backwards to me. Socialism. It's by Michael Harrington. Rufus recommended that one. And Socialism Seriously. This one's by Danny Catch. And Karen Krisenberry recommended that one to me. I also found an article, or my Jessica, who lives with us here, recommended an article by Oscar Wilde on the internet. If you look up The Soul of Man under Socialism, it is a fascinating essay, long, book size. He is if you want to read somebody advocating something with all the strength of a powerful mind, read The Soul of Man under Socialism. I learned there are many forms of socialism, and those of interest to me tend to fall into two groups: democratic socialism and autocratic socialism. Autocratic socialism is the ones that have the power at the top, a dictator or a small group running the scene. I found it interesting that the original definition of socialism, as envisioned by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, leaned more toward the democratic side. But I don't care what started. I'm just interested in what works. I could label them, instead of democratic and autocratic, I could call it hairy socialism and other socialism. But I'll stick to democratic. Usually, when I use the word socialism, I'm referring to democratic socialism. I will tell you a little about that. I'll start with what democratic and autocratic socialism have in common. Both kinds of socialism are such that the state, the government, control a much larger part of the economy than our system. Both kinds of socialism consider that capitalism should be far more restrained than in our system. Both kinds of socialism consider their systems to be in direct competition with our kind of capitalism. Both kinds of socialism claim that their goal is to create a system that provides the highest possible quality of life to all citizens. So, China, North Korea, and so forth, they have claimed the title socialism, and I'm not going to argue with them. I'll just label the kind I like democratic socialism. Both authors I read spent a lot of time explaining the problems associated with capitalism. So that's a big emphasis, and when you look at socialism, is what's wrong with capitalism. That's a lot of what I was reading. However, I need first to make very clear that what I'm talking about. Both authors I read were strongly opposed to the authors in these books were both for democratic socialism. They didn't even recognize the other kind as socialism. But that's just a point of view. They didn't like socialism in which the people of the nation had little or no say in the policies chosen by the government. That was anathema to them. They advocate what I call democratic socialism. Here are some statements about how our system would change if we adopted democratic socialism. A socialist nation would have more restrictions on individual freedom than our nation. One example of this would be the impact of adopting a nationalized healthcare system. That takes away some of the freedom of doctors and a lot of the system. Socialism would greatly restrict the role of capitalism in our system. In fact, that's the primary basis from which socialism arose, was to deal with the problems of capitalism. A socialist government would not permit the concentration of wealth and related power that the upper 1%, or upper 10%, have in our system. So socialism is a direct threat to those people, and they will fight it any way they can. That's where a big part of the resistance to socialism is coming from. It's coming from the people whose elite status would be lost. The most powerful and wealthy people in our system want us to think that socialism is a bad thing, an evil system. It's in their best interest to do that. However, here is a statement about socialism that I assumed was correct. This is what I had been taught until recently. Or this is what I thought was so. Socialism means that all important decisions about national policy will be made by a centralized authority with little or no influence or control from the vast majority of citizens. In my opinion, that is a flat-out lie. It's just not true. There is a form of socialism that is that way, but that's not what I'm advocating or what Bernie Sanders was advocating. It would be true if we were to adopt the autocratic socialism like that in Russia, China, or North Korea, but that's not what we're after. In nations with democratic socialism, important decisions about national policy are made by or strongly influenced by all citizens in these nations. That fact is not publicly known and has been hidden and just needs to get out. The fact that autocratic socialist states exist is used to taint all socialism. This tainting is a manipulation of the facts intended, successfully so far, to cause a large portion of our voters to reject any candidate whose voters have been led to believe leans towards socialism. We saw that in the last election. To label a politician as a socialist is a bad thing in our system. Bernie did okay in some ways. Citizens of the United States place a very high value on personal freedom. However, any form of government will impose some restrictions on personal freedom. Our legal system does that. We must address two questions. Do the benefits of giving some additional control to a central government outweigh the loss of some personal freedom? And the second one, which is I get to at the end of this talk, is it possible to adopt a democratic socialist system and avoid moving on to an autocratic socialist system? That's one of the fears, and it's not zero risk. Our system already has some aspects of socialism. Medicare is a good example. Federal prisons, national parks, these are all socialist things. Those who benefit most from capitalism, the rich and powerful in our nation, have successfully convinced a large part of the voting public that any move towards socialism will begin a process toward complete loss of personal freedom, valued so highly in our society. They do not allow for the possibility of a democratic socialist system rather than an autocratic socialist system. They want us to believe that anything like socialism is going to lead toward something like China. Socialism will indeed mean some loss of personal freedom. However, there are nations with socialist governments that have retained almost as much personal freedom as we have. Given that I think we are being manipulated by those in power, we may even have more freedom in a democratic socialist system. Now let's look at some of the ways democratic socialism differs from autocratic socialism. In other words, the main difference is that democratic socialism, in that the citizens of the nation are able to control or strongly influence national policy. In contrast, in autocratic socialism, such policy is controlled by a central authority, either one person or a relatively small group of people who are not chosen by the people they rule. Here are some quotes defining democratic socialism. This is from the book, Catch's book. With socialism, working people control the government and the government controls the economy. Working people control the government and the government controls the economy. Without democracy at every level of society, state control of the economy has nothing to do with socialism. So defining socialism as the state controlling the economy is just wrong. It has to have democracy, or that isn't the kind of socialism that we want. Socialism is about giving people a say in how every aspect of their lives is run. Those advocating this claim that we don't have as much of that now as we should. The distinction is important in understanding part of our system's bias against everything labeled socialism. I hope I've given you some idea of what I mean by democratic socialism and how it differs from autocratic. One is a government of the people, a bottom-up system. The other is a government of a centralized authority, a top-down system. However, another aspect of socialism that is equally important is that socialism came into existence primarily as an attempt to create a system that would do away with the problems associated with capitalism. That was what Marx was doing. He was trying to deal with what the horrors of capitalism. The history of capitalism, why it was a good thing when it came in, it destroyed the feudal system, all this. There's a lot of baggage going on here, but now we can see the results. Now, this is my personal experience, which caused me to think about doing this talk. Starting about 10 years ago, I began to realize that I had a number of unexamined assumptions about our system that were not confirmed by my experience. The main one I want to discuss is this. I assumed that capitalism was the best possible economic system for our nation. I no longer believe that. My understanding is that capitalism is a system based on I'm going to define capitalism as I see it, is a system based on the idea that free competition between individuals and businesses is the best way to assure the needs of a society are met most efficiently. In other words, by businesses competing, they're going to deliver the needs of the society. The basic idea is the ongoing attempt to maximize profits will continue to seek what consumers, our people, will buy, and will continue to improve the process of producing and delivering those goods at the lowest possible cost. That was capitalism. That was the thing. Adam Smith stated that competition to maximize profits would in effect be an invisible hand that would somehow shape the process to best serve the needs of all citizens. It would be best for both the consumers and the producers of goods and services. Here's how I began to have doubts about capitalism in our system. Somewhere along the line, probably starting with climate concerns in the 1970s, there was discussion of hidden costs such as damage to the environment. Manufacturers could pollute land or water and it would not add to the manufacturing cost. Occasionally I would read an article about something like an investment firm that would acquire a company and liquidate it at a significant profit. There was no concern for the harm done to the communities or the employees. These employees who lost their jobs got no part of the profit of the liquidation. There are many other instances where maximizing profits lead to harm to people, such as exploiting cheap foreign labor. It began to dawn on me that, as I put it, capitalism does not have a soul. Capitalism has no direct concern for who or what is harmed in the process of maximizing profits. Their concerns for employee morale, reputation in the community, other human values are only because these factors impact their future success. A profit-making corporation has no empathy. Capitalism did indeed raise the standard of living of those nations that adopted it. It supported and encouraged the Industrial Revolution and has done the same for the more recent Information Revolution. However, it now seems to me, and many others, that capitalism has some serious flaws, and those flaws continue to create horrible collateral damage. The damage includes unfair distribution of wealth, economic instability, damage to the environment, and increasingly powerful weapons of destruction, to name a few. The essay by Oscar Wilde is worth looking at. Go on the internet, look up Oscar Wilde and capitalism, and it's one of the most interesting, vindictive kind of essays I've ever read. Here's a brilliant mind who uses his power to attack something with a vengeance. Capitalism maximized profits, but those profits did not benefit most of the workers involved. Instead, they were exploited. For example, coal miners in West Virginia lived miserable, high-risk, low-paid lives, while investors who owned the mines grew richer. Something was amiss here. This realization confused me. I could see the collateral damage that capitalism would do. However, I did not see an alternative that would provide the benefits of open competition to sell the best products at the lowest price. That's where good government comes in. It's the government's job to create a system of laws, regulations, regulating authorities, anything else needed to keep companies from acting against the best interests of society. Why wasn't that working better? One of the reasons was that capitalism resulted in a process in which a few companies became very large and powerful. In reading Socialism by Michael Harrington, I found this quote: "The medium-sized capitalists took over the smaller competitors, and in turn were taken over by the larger capitalists." That's the nature of the game. The companies became large enough to significantly influence politicians. They helped control who got elected. They rewarded those in government who made decisions that impacted their profitability. The system became broken. That's where we are today. Here are a few quotes about the bad side of capitalism. Maybe here are a few quotes. Here's my favorite one. The future of all life on the planet is losing to the short-term opportunity for a few people to make even more money. Let me read that again. The future of all life on the planet is losing out to the short-term opportunity for a few people to make even more money. That alone should make the case against capitalism a no-brainer. Capitalism is a fundamentally unjust and exploitative system that is going to make people search for an alternative. Capitalism has dispensed with even a pretense of justice or efficiency and openly operates on the principle that might makes right. Capitalism is being widely questioned today because in the past few years it is shown that what is good for this thing called the economy, usually defined by stock prices and growth rates, doesn't have much to do with what is good for most of us. So I now see that capitalism is in our system is doing horrible things. Is there a better system? I hope so. I spent 6 years in a university learning how to serve the capitalist system. That's what I studied. I find it difficult to conceive of an alternative that would deliver the efficiency and ongoing improvements of competition. Though I do not understand how they make it work, I believe that a number of nations have been able to create a kind of socialism that permits enough regulated capitalism to allow its industry to compete in the world market, provide a higher standard of living to its citizens, and somehow end up being ranked near the top in the list of countries on the happiness index that Randy Grumpelt mentioned in his recent talk. These governments are forms of democratic socialism. Here is a list of the top 10 nations on the happiness index. I hope. Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, Netherlands, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Austria. At least some of them are democratic socialist states. None of them are autocratic socialist states. I'm going to guess, and I didn't do my homework, that all of them are significantly more socialist than we are. Higher taxes, bigger role of government. I want to cover 2 more topics. Okay. The first is a quote attempting to define the difference between a liberal in the U.S. and a socialist. Many of us are liberals. Liberalism can agree with socialism that some things about capitalism should be reformed, and socialists can work alongside liberals to win those changes. Where we differ is that liberalism views reforms as ways to preserve capitalism, while socialism sees them as steps toward replacing them. I don't know where that leaves me. I don't know enough to see how we could replace capitalism, but I gather that these successful socialist states are essentially doing that. My final topic is a concern related to socialism. Michael Harrington's book begins with some of the history of socialism. There have been a number of nations that tried to form a socialism and failed. The most extreme example was Russia. The October Revolution that occurred in Russia in 1917 led to the first truly socialist state. This was a truly socialist democratic system. It was bottom-up, not top-down. It was a Soviet democracy on a national scale. However, Michael Harrington said, this process eventually led to the most bureaucratic and centralized social system in human history. This was a system of anti-democratic and anti-capitalist socialization. So there is a risk that if you set off on the path to give the government more control, that bad things could happen and the government could end up becoming top-down power. It happened in Russia. What started down the path of democratic socialism ended up autocratic socialism. I want to add in the experience of Germany coming under the control of Hitler, and the parallels between that experience and some of what we saw in the recent 4 years of Donald Trump suggest that complex political dynamics can divert what appears to be a healthy path into a totalitarian dictatorship. So those who are opposed to socialism may have some valid concerns that there is a risk that this could be used to create a dictatorship. So it's not clear to me, I didn't know enough to see, how do you avoid that? But it is being avoided. If we are to pursue socialism, we must do so carefully and on guard against its ending up places we do not want to go. I had titled this talk, A Way of Life, a Political System, a Philosophy. I haven't told you much about the political system. The philosophy, it comes down to saying that socialism has no soul. Oscar Wilde says that capitalism actually destroys the soul of man. Those who are successful become greedy and lose any empathy with others. Those who fail become depressed, angry, bitter, and envious. So his point is that capitalism actually damages the human psyche. And there's some evidence of that. Let's see. How am I? Doing well on my time, which is rare. I hope I've given you some things to think about. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. I didn't read the entire books. I probably should. I read enough to sort of give me some things to think about, and I've passed it on to you. I look forward to the discussion. I am not an authority you can ask questions for. Steve Jett, hi Steve, I think has taught classes that include covering socialism. And Steve, I encourage you to think about giving a talk about a more academic side understanding of it. But I'd be glad to hear your comments and any suggestions or what you think about what's going on with this whole area. So that's my perspective on socialism.